You might be asking yourself, why is there a statue of an American born Kentucky president in the seat of government in a country we won a war against? Well, the answer might surprise you, and it doesn't start with just Abe Lincoln here. It starts with a man named John Brown, who started the job that old Abe here would eventually finish. To understand why a statue of a Kentucky born American president stands in the heart of a country that America supposedly defeated in a war, um, you have to know something that you don't really see on 4th of July postcards. That a country that we are still bragging to about winning a war over in the following 2.5 centuries has almost completely forgotten ever happened. The American Revolution to the British curriculum is a paragraph at best, sometimes a sentence, and occasionally in better schools an asterisk. I have asked what they have learned about the American Revolution in school here. They have looked at me in a way that you would probably look at a small child when they ask earnestly about Father Christmas. It's not about malice, it's about timing. In 1789, 13 years after the American Revolution, France had its own revolution, which was significantly more relevant to Britain on the account that France is about 20 miles away from the coast versus 3,000 miles across an ocean. And then 10 years after that, Napoleon happened. And Napoleon, unlike the Americans, was actively trying to invade Britain, something that mattered a little bit more. So while Americans were mythologizing their founding story, Britain was preoccupied with a small matter of a French general who was going to march into the center of London by Christmas, was what it looked like. And if you think about it, that's a pretty good reason to forget about the Americans. Turns out we were not the main character. At best, we were a slightly disappointing warm up act, and we played to a half full venue. Meanwhile, the headliner was over across the channel, and yeah, the British did not get over us. They just simply had other plans. Now, the American Revolution in America is taught pretty much similar, but little differences between the North and the South. If you went to school in the North, the Revolution is taught as a moral coming of age. It's about ideas, it's about enlightenment. It's those brave Bostonians dressed as people. They were definitely not throwing tea into a harbor because the principle of taxation without representation was unbearable on their conscience. It is in the Northern telling a story about freedom, a story about democracy, a story about self determination, and the great American novel that was already written in advance, mostly, in which we were the noble main characters, of course. It is also in the Northern telling the moment America became morally superior to Europe, a status we have in the years since very carefully maintained by simply just saying it over and over without any real facts or data that back that up. But let's go to the Southern version. If you went to school in the American South, where I did, the revolution is roughly taught the same way, but with a couple extra italics on that local autonomy part. In the Southern telling, it's a story about plucky Americans refusing to be governed by people far, far away. It's a small group of locals deciding that distant, centralized, bureaucratic government just had no right to tell them what to do. And if that sounds familiar, It's because it is, and the South would go on 80 years later to make the exact same argument about something entirely different and significantly worse. But what is the actual version? Well, so if the British were not really paying attention and the Americans were paying attention to a story that was largely invented, what was the American Revolution really about then? Short answer, a lot of things. Most of them more dull than the official version, of course, and at least one of them considerably worse than the official version. It was in part about tax, it was in part about land. The colonies did not enjoy paying for a war that Britain had fought partly on their behalf, which is like the 18th century version of refusing to chip in for dinner after you've already eaten most of what you've ordered. Yeah, the land part. Britain had told the American colonists that they were not to keep expanding westward into indigenous territory. And the colonists were very much set on going westward into indigenous territory. And they took this rather personally. And they also tell you about the tyrant, the king, the big bad George III, the abomination of liberty, the alleged villain in the whole revolution. He was not in charge. By 1776, the British monarchy had largely been ceremonial for about a century. Real power lived in Parliament and had done so since about 1688. So when the American school children are taught about how they rose up against tyranny and of George III, what they are not told is that George III, constitutionally speaking, was doing what elected legislator in London told him to do. We did not throw off a king, we threw off Parliament, which is far less cinematic of a story. It doesn't sound great for the founding myth, which is probably why nobody really tells it that way. It was partly significant, but largely unspoken. But the thing we don't talk about was that it was largely about slavery. In 1772, 4 years before the Declaration of Independence, a British court ruled on the Somerset case. And it said that slavery had no basis in English law. Not through the whole empire, it wasn't banned yet, but it was a tremor. It was a signal, a polite suggestion to every wealthy plantation owner in the American colonies that the legal weather was changing. And many of these men, 4 years later, signed a document declaring that all men were created equal. They owned other human beings. They were not throwing off a tyrant in that situation. They were trying to get out from under a legal system that was beginning to make their fortunes a little inconvenient, which brings us to the part of the 4th of July story you'd never get to hear in a speech. America's founding sin. George Washington owned 300 slaves in Mount Vernon. I've been there. He signed the Declaration. He signed Declaration of Revolutionary Documents. He led an army for liberty. And then he went home to the people he owned. And Thomas Jefferson, a man who wrote the words, "All men are created equal," owned more than 600 enslaved people in his lifetime. He fathered at least 6 children with Sally Hemings, a woman he owned, and, legally speaking, could not tell him no. James Madison, the principal architect of the Constitution, owned over 100 enslaved people. James Monroe owned dozens. Same thing. Out of America's first 18 presidents, 12 of them owned other human beings. 8 of them owned human beings while sitting in the White House. So the founding fathers gathered in Philadelphia and they wrote the Constitution for a nation built on the proposition that all men are created equally. And some of those men in their personal lives were currently owning other men. So their solution for this was the three-fifths compromise, which is exactly as it sounds. They agreed in writing in the founding documents of the United States that an enslaved person would count as three-fifths of a human being. For the purpose of congressional representation, of course. They were not a whole human being. They were not a non-human being. They were just three-fifths of a human being. And that is in the Constitution. It's in the actual physical document. Article 1, Section 2. Look it up if you don't believe me. The fraction is right there on the page. And this was not an oversight. It was not a quirk of the time. It was a load-bearing beam for the founding of the United States of America. And the founders, they knew slavery was wrong. Several of them even wrote it down, ironically. Washington omitted his enslaved people in his will after his death, as if that would atone him for that sin. Jefferson described slavery in his own private writings as a fire bell in the night, and we have the wolf by the ears, and we can neither hold him nor set him free. And then he did nothing. Neither one of them did anything. They died still owning slaves. He even had Sally Hemings' children sold after his death to pay, sold her children after his death to pay for his debts. They were his children, too. The founding fathers were not stupid. They were not ignorant. They were not, in the popular phrase people like to say, men of their time. They knew better. There were plenty of other men who looked in the face of slavery and point blank said, I will not participate. Some of them, we will find out, were British, and some of them were Black, and some of them were Quakers in Philadelphia that looked Ben Franklin straight in the face and told him, you are on the wrong side of this. Yet they simply preferred their comfortable lives. They weren't willing to change that. So they wrote a magnificent document about liberty. They signed it. They signed it with the same hand that they used to sign papers when they purchased slaves. And instead of dealing with it, they kicked the entire moral problem down the street. Let their grandchildren clean up the mess. This is what people mean when they call slavery the original sin of the United States of America. It was literally baked into the founding documents. A country that was built half free and half not by men who knew the contradiction would not hold and who chose not to be the ones to fix it. So later on, the Civil War was really no surprise. It was a delivery of that promise. 84 years after the Declaration of Independence, the bill arrived. The country had decided, finally, whether words on parchment meant what they said. It's the bridge between the 4th of July and what happened next. The revolution wrote the check, and the founders simply refused to cash it. The Civil War was the country trying to cover that check with blood, 600,000 people dead, and all because the men who began the whole story couldn't live by what they wrote. But that's where my favorite historical person comes into play. John Brown. John Brown's body lies a mouldering in the grave. John Brown's body lies a mouldering. Now let me tell you about the boy and the iron shovel. To understand why John Brown ended up doing what he did, you have to go back to when he was 12 years old. He was driving cattle on horseback to deliver it to a U.S. Marshal, something common then, and he stayed the night with this U.S. Marshal after delivering the cattle, also very common for travelers to this time. And the U.S. Marshal had a young enslaved boy about the age of 12, roughly the same age that John Brown was at the time. Maybe he was a little younger, but pretty close. And while John Brown was staying there, he saw this U.S. Marshal beat this young boy with an iron shovel, a child. John Brown never recovered from that. And for the rest of his life, he wrote about this. He later said that that moment was the moment, in his own words, he became a sworn enemy of slavery. He got this. He was only 12 years old, just a little farm boy, watching another little farm boy be beaten with a piece of metal, all because someone else had the right to own it. Now, people will tell you John Brown was an extremist, a fanatic, that he was pushed far too much by his convictions. He was not. He was a man who, at the age of 12, was forced to watch what slavery actually was. And he decided then and there that one day he would be able to do something about it. The man who beat the enslaved children with iron shovels apparently was well within his bounds of American popular, polite society. And then the man later who decided to fight against slavery is not seen as anything other than a criminal. I think that is a confession to the deep-rooted issues in the country. Now, the American Civil War, in true American fashion, there's another event that most people have never heard of. It's called the Bleeding Kansas. Now, it's called Bleeding Kansas because that's what happened. It bled. And in 1854, Illinois Senator Stephen Douglas decided that the question of whether new states should be slave states or free states would be decided by something called popular sovereignty, which is a fancy phrase for you lot all fight it out and just let me know who wins. So, pro-slavery settlers called the Border Ruffians moved and poured into the Kansas Territory to make sure that it entered the Union as a slave state. And on the flip side, the anti-slavery settlers, who became known as the Free Staters, poured in to stop them. And then, predictably, they began to kill each other. This was open guerrilla warfare on American soil between 1854 and 1859. Towns were burned, newspapers were destroyed. There were men shot in the road fighting over if you had the right to own somebody else. Now, Kansas bled for 5 years. This is before the official Civil War had even started. And you know how much of this I learned in my school in Kentucky, 3 states over? Absolutely none of it. None of it. I had to learn it all myself reading later in life. Now, John Brown walked into this bleeding territory with that iron shovel story now as a grown man. He looks like, in every surviving portrait we have seen of him, a man who has a personal grievance against Satan, and he is there to collect. He goes to Kansas with his sons and a couple other people who decided to follow him. And in May of 1856, after pro-slavers sacked the Free State town of Lawrence, John Brown took his 5 sons and several other of those people he brought to a creek, and they killed 5 pro-slavery settlers in the night. And this is the part, the story, the American history textbooks, if you find it in one, usually wants to pause and tell you, well, there was violence on both sides. There was, but one side's fight was to keep owning people, and the other was to free people. So when they say there was violence on both sides, what it actually means is violence against slavery and violence to keep slavery, which I think morally are not the same issue at all. I would even say they're on the same shelf or in the same store. Now, John Brown understood this in 1859. It took the rest of America about 160 years to catch up, and I would say many are frankly still struggling with that concept to this day. And in October 1859, John Brown led the raid to the Federal Army and Harper's Ferry, Virginia. He intended to seize the federal armory and armed all the enslaved citizens of America. Um, he intended to start a war that in 16 months would start anyway. Well, he was caught. He was tried. And on the 2nd of December, 1859, he was hanged. He was the first American ever tried for treason and put to death. Think about that. A man who was fighting slavery is the first person considered a traitor to America and put to death. He was not a foreign agent. He was not a spy. He did not take arms up against the government like the South. He was a man who in his heart was against slavery and picked up a rifle to free human beings that were being owned, bought, beaten, branded, and worked to death by other human beings. And for that, the United States government decided he was a traitor worth killing. He's never been pardoned, by the way, not by Lincoln, not by the governor of Virginia, not by any court order, not by Congress, nothing. For 167 years since that happened, the official position of the United States of America is that John Brown is a criminal, was a criminal, and a traitor to his country for fighting the men who owned other people. Now, in American public schools, John Brown is not really taught about. Again, if he's mentioned, it's barely a footnote. He's told as a bit unhinged. He's a bit of an extremist, a man who regrettably took things just a little too far. The implication being that a proper civilized country, in response to an industrialized scale of ownership of other people, would solve these issues with, a benefit concert or a strongly worded letter that says, don't you do that. I think, personally, he took things exactly as far as they should have been taken, and they needed to go. There is an old saying amongst Unioners that John Brown did nothing wrong. And I think the history books should be far kinder to his memory. Which brings me to, how is the Civil War taught? Because all of these combine together, really. And if you are from the North in America, it's taught as the war to end slavery. The South succeeded, the North fought, the South lost, Abe Lincoln got shot, done. The end. It's a semester at best when you're being taught it. Everyone just moves on. And that is broadly accurate, but in the American South, where I went to school, the Civil War is taught a little bit different, or the War of Northern Aggression. It's taught as a tragedy and a misunderstanding, a noble disagreement between gentlemen. It's about the the nature of federalism. It was, we are assured about states' rights and only states' rights, with slavery kind of in the background of the cause. But that's not true. The Civil War was absolutely about slavery. The states that succeeded from the Union wrote it in their official succession documents. The reason they were succeeding was for the right to have slaves. Mississippi's Declaration alone wrote the word slavery 7 times in its open paragraph. South Carolina mentions it directly as the reason for succession. Georgia, Texas, all of them, they wrote it down. They were not subtle. They were not coy. They were defending in writing their right to own people. So the states' rights argument, it came later. It came so that grandkids of slave owners and slave masters didn't have to go to parent-teacher conferences and feel kind of awkward. Now, it's the same war, it's the same facts, but somehow in the same country, there's 2 completely different stories. one of which I was personally given in a public school by adults who absolutely knew better. There's also one other person to this story I would like to add, and that would be Corporal James Berkelow. He was a Union corporal in the cavalry. There are historical documentaries about him. He's also my great-great-grandfather. He is my Meemaw's grandpa. He was born in Kentucky, a border state, officially neutral, technically Union state, practically a mess. And when I say practically a mess, I mean he had to leave Kentucky and go to Illinois with his brothers to enlist in the Union Army. He didn't get drafted, he willingly went. He crossed the river because he could not necessarily trust his home state to do the right thing at the time. So they signed up for the Union and brought their own horses. And they wanted to be on the right side of this. They got actually 40 cents a day for bringing their own horses. And I will put a picture of him in here right now. So while he was off fighting in blue, the part of Kentucky where he came from, where I came from, Henderson, Kentucky, was on the border of the war. It was the front line. It was being raided by Confederate guerrillas. The Ohio River, which is my town, was that front line. The Confederate raiders launched attacks across it. When the water goes really low, in the summer, the sandbanks are so high you can walk across it. It was a good tactical point. Now, we don't really talk about that where I was growing up. We barely learn about that. There's a little section in the museum at the library if you want to go look for yourself, but that's it. And there are no statues of my great-great-grandpa in Henderson, even though he should be something they should be very proud of. Now, the Confederate generals, they get statues. My great-great-grandpa, there's a documentary that mentions him in a footnote if you dig deep and you can find it. Which brings me back to the first question. Why is Lincoln in Parliament Square, you ask? So, during the Civil War, the textile workers up north in northern England and Lancashire, they refused to process cotton that had been picked by enslaved people. That includes the American South. They sided with the Union. And this was not easy for them. They were starving. The mills had shut down. Their entire economy of textile making depended on having this cotton. But they stood by the right choice. And Lincoln wrote them a letter that said, "In this instance of sublime Christian heroism, which has not been surpassed by any age or in any country," as a thank you note. And that is why a Kentuckian stands in the middle of a London square today, between Churchill and a parliament he never sat in. Now, the British may not teach the American Revolution in their schools as much, but they do teach this. They built a statue of him for this. And this is the America that we're still arguing about. Do we keep up statues of people who lost a war that waged war on their own country? Make it make sense, right? Also, I want to discuss something. So a couple weeks ago, I got a comment on one of my videos. Recently, a Texan informed me that I must not truly be Southern, and if I was, the South must be happy to be rid of me. I'd like to take a moment to address that. And I'm going to do it with my proper Southern manners and my whole chest here. Sir, I am from Henderson, Kentucky. I am the great-great-granddaughter of a Union corporal. He decided to leave the state and enlist and fight for the right side of history with his brothers on their horses for 40 cents a day. And I would say that could possibly make me as Southern as possible without leaching sweet tea out of my frickin' pores. And before I go any further, let's talk about Texas here. Have you heard of the holiday Juneteenth? Do you know how and why that started? June 19th because that was the day in 1865 that enslaved people in Texas were finally informed that they had been free for the past 2 years. Down in Galveston, they sent a Union general to read the Emancipation Proclamation because Texas couldn't be trusted to tell the truth. Um, I guess you could say not much has changed. So, when a Texan tells me I'm not really Southern, all I hear is a man whose state fails at the most basic of functions. And I think what actually being Southern means, it means not licking the boot of whoever has the loudest flag. Being Southern is not pledging allegiance to a tradition of owning people. Being Southern, being properly Southern, is standing up. John Brown, who became a Virginian gallows footnote, it's my great-great-grandpa, Corporal James Burklow, who left his own hometown with his family to enlist and be on the right side of things. It's Abe Lincoln, born in a cabin in Hodgenville, Kentucky, who finished John Brown's job. And while we're talking about the South here, let's also talk about another Kentuckian, Muhammad Ali, born in Louisville, Kentucky, a man who refused to be drafted into a war that he did not believe in. And he went to prison for that principle. And he once said this: "Service to others is the rent you pay for being here on earth." That is what Kentucky produces. That is what being properly Southern means and to be proud of. It's not heritage, it's not nostalgia, it's not a stupid flag. It's not pretending a war was about anything other than what it was actually about. It's about service, it's about conscience. It's a willingness to stand on the right side, even when standing there is a real danger. I am a Southerner. I just refuse to be a Southerner who lies about the truth. So, on that note, happy 4th of July. The revolution I celebrate today is not the one I was told in school. It's not about a king in charge, which I have to admit I was also thought that was pretty true until recently put it together. Don't know why I didn't put it together. I knew the parliament. Anyway, it's about moving in the right direction. It's about how men who found a country decided that half the people could be owned, not realizing that contradiction would not hold, and not handing those bills to the generation below us. 600,000 people died in the Civil War. It's not pretty. It's not great. We did that to our own people because the founders refused to do what's right. It came at a real cost. And the man who tried to stop it the hardest, John Brown, only got a noose and a footnote, and to this very day is still listed as a traitor and a criminal. And then Abe Lincoln got a bullet to the head, and we know why that happened too. And somewhere in Kentucky, all those years ago, my great-great-grandpa was born, who also did the right thing when it was not easy to do so. And later on, Cassius Clay, Muhammad Ali, the greatest, refused to be drafted into a war on principle. And he stood by that principle, and he was able to cash that principle. That is the Kentucky I am from. That is the South I am from. And if you want to know what I'm celebrating today, it's not a marketing campaign. It's not the brochure. It's not the version of the story that was handed to me in middle school and elementary school. I'm celebrating old John Brown, who saw at 12 what was obvious, and how all of the beginning actions led to those moments, and how they were always known to be wrong. I'm celebrating Abe Lincoln, a fellow Kentuckian who did what was right. I'm celebrating those Lancashire freaking mill workers who, even at their own cost, causing their own famine and their own economy to tank, to stand for what was right. And celebrating my great-great-grandpa. Thanks, Grandpa. I'm celebrating the idea of what my country could be, and those from that country who show you its possibilities. And briefly, in moments, you can see the good. That's what July 4th means to me. I want to leave you with a quote from John Brown. It's from his trial. It's his last statement. Here, let me pull this up because I don't want to mess this one up. Now, if it is deemed necessary that I should forfeit my life for the furtherance of the ends of justice, and mingle my blood further with the blood of my children and with the blood of millions in this slave country whose rights are disregarded by the wicked, cruel, and unjust enactments, I submit, so let it be done. Powerful. For those of you who have lived abroad, especially if you're American, I want to know, what have you learned that was not in your textbooks growing up? What have you learned that was a contradiction? Or if you are not American, has this been a situation for you when you've lived in another country, finding out, different facts, good and bad? Let me know in the comments below. I'm genuinely interested because while I thought I always knew so much about these things, I am constantly learning a different perspective. So on that note, happy 4th of July from London, from a country that does not remember a war that we won. And quiet shout out to John Brown. Still a traitor, still right. If you enjoyed this video, please like and subscribe and leave a comment below. And as always, a special thanks to my members. And be sure to check out the Tudor Yank store live now.